Okay, this is chapter 4 on constitutional law. We are not going to get in depth into the Constitution, although it's a fascinating subject, and also can be taken in depth in one of our other courses, CRJ 103. If you've already taken that course, this will be a little repetitive, but hopefully still interesting. If you haven't taken it, I highly recommend it. You can send me an email if you want more information about it. Um, However, we will go through here. The Constitution's set out in your book. You will have to read it at some point along with the amendments. We have an assignment about it, so you'll get to that eventually if you haven't already. The um, the body of the Constitution itself is fairly short. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution are called the Bill of Rights. Usually it's one of those amendments that people are talking about when they say things like, oh, my constitutional rights have been violated. They're usually talking about something within usually within the first 8 amendments. And we're going to focus specifically today on, or for this PowerPoint, on the First Amendment. You can take a look in your book about the information on how the Constitution itself is amended. It's all set out in there, so you can take a look at that. And also, you should probably visit the Supreme Court of the United States website. It's actually, there's a small bio for each of the U.S. Supreme Court justices in your book, but that's set out more fully on the website. Something to keep in mind when you're thinking about current events and current Supreme Court cases is the makeup of our U.S. Supreme Court right now. In a nutshell, there are 9 justices on the U.S. Supreme Court. 4 of those justices are fairly liberal-minded justices, and I'm speaking specifically of Ginsburg, Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan. On the other side of the bench are the 4 very more conservative-minded justices, Roberts, Scalia, Alito, and Thomas. So we've got 4 liberals, 4 conservatives, and then there's one right in the middle, Justice Kennedy, who tends to go either way. So you can appreciate that we're in kind of a tense dynamic right now on the bench. Now, that's not to say they always vote as a block like that. By no means. You can find cases all over the place where the justices change, ideology. But in general, that's the makeup of the bench right now. Now, there are general elections coming up, and there are also at least a couple of the justices who will probably have to step down from the bench in the foreseeable future, basically because of age. So there will be some appointments coming up to the bench, either, if not by this sitting president, by President Obama, then by whomever wins the general election, who's the next president. So that's an amazing power, and we'll see how that balance on the bench either continues or changes in the very near future. Anyway, keep that in mind when you think about and review current cases. It's interesting to go into the details of the cases and look at who voted for what. However, moving on, I'm not going through the terms. You don't need me to do that with you. Take a look at the vocabulary in your book in chapter 4, and it will give you the verbiage that you need to know what they're talking about when we talk about some of these cases. It's in there. Take a look at it. What I want to focus on is the First Amendment cases for this particular segment. And First Amendment, we're talking about free speech, free press, free assembly, free exercise of religion, and freedom from the establishment of a religion by the government. So those are 2 definitely distinct, related but different freedoms. So don't get those two mixed up. The age-old debate about freedoms contained within the First Amendment are how free is free. Of course, we don't have absolute freedom for any of the enumerated rights. And the reason for that is because our society would be in chaos if that were the case. So what the court has to do is to look at the freedom that's at stake and then balance that individual freedom with the greater good of the society. So for the government to come in and restrict an individual's basic free speech, for example, the government has to prove that it has a really good, what we call compelling interest in order to restrict an individual freedom. And the court has to make that decision. Is the government's pronouncement that it is protecting society a good enough reason to limit someone's otherwise free speech or free religion or free press, whatever is the specific freedom? So that balance is constant in these First Amendment cases. Take a look at Texas versus Johnson. That's a free speech. It's actually an action that was considered to be protected by free speech. And then look at Morse versus Frederick. That's a case where, again, free speech was at issue, but it was within the confines of public school, which, if you haven't already figured out, you do have rights within a public school, but they are definitely more restricted than within the general public. And that Morse versus Frederick sort of explains some of that. Then the Wisconsin versus Yoder case, which is a free exercise of religion. And I'd like you to contrast that case with the cases under the You Be the Judge, specifically Danny Hauser case. And there are some other cases in that You Be the Judge PowerPoint that talks about free exercise of religion and how that has to be balanced with medical treatment for children, which is always a tough issue. For the rest of this PowerPoint, though, we are going to talk about the Westboro Baptist Church case. That's the title of the case is Snyder versus Phelps. Westboro Baptist Church, for those of you who don't know, is a church in Kansas. It is not a Baptist church. In fact, they don't have affiliation with any mainstream religion. In fact, they hate most mainstream religions. They were established by a gentleman named Fred Phelps, who populated the church pretty much exclusively with his family. And their primary function was to, they felt, to enlighten the rest of us that we as Americans were doomed to hell because our society is too tolerant of, among other things, gay rights, and that God was striking down Americans, for example, in the wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, because of the American position on gay rights and things like that. Now, just so you, they disliked pretty much everyone for some reason or another. They are, I shouldn't speak of them in past tense, I wish I could, but they are a very hateful group. If you're not within their very strict confines, then you're evil. They took it upon themselves to try to get their word across by protesting at very sensitive, emotionally charged events. So, for example, they would go to the funerals of recently returned soldiers who were killed in action in Iraq or Afghanistan. One of those was Matthew Snyder. He was killed in action, returned home to Maryland. His parents held a funeral. The Westboro Baptist Church found out about it and decided that they would go to the funeral and protest. The church officials contacted the police in advance of the funeral and told them of their plans to show up at the funeral the next day. The police department for that locality couldn't stop them. There was no law preventing them from doing it, but they said, okay, if you are coming, then you will comply with all of our demands. You will only protest in this public park across the street. You will not interfere with the funeral at all. There will be no violence. You'll have to be peaceful. You'll have to come and go within the hours that we tell you. And the church members complied with the police requirements. There was a protest, although the Snyders did not know during the funeral that there were protesters outside. They did find out about it after the fact because, of course, the media reported about it. Mr. Snyder, understandably, was very upset and sued the church for an intentional tort, basically emotional distress. He won at jury at the trial and was given a verdict of $2 million of compensatory damages. In other words, damages that would compensate him for his emotional distress, and then another $8 million as a punitive damage. We'll talk more about that when we talk about torts, but that's just what it sounds like. $8 million meant to punish the Westboro Baptist Church, the Phelps family. I think the hope was that such a verdict would drive them out of business. But of course, it was appealed. The first appeal reduced the verdict substantially, and then eventually the verdict was eliminated. So Mr. Snyder then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, alleging that funerals should be off limits, that there has to be a restriction on free speech around emotionally sensitive events like this. The U.S. Supreme Court decided that the protest was about matters of public concern. There was no individual attack on Corporal Snyder, that it was a public protest in a public park on a public street. It took place within police guidance, and it was peaceful. There was no interference, and in fact, the Snyders didn't even know during the funeral that anything was going on. The court said, and I think correctly, that even if speech is offensive, we have to protect it according to our constitutional laws. That speech that otherwise complies, and in this case, there was no personal attack. It was a public statement. As long as speech otherwise complies, we can't stop it because we don't like the message. And although it's difficult to agree with when you look at hate mongers like the Ku Klux Klan or Westboro Baptist Church, if you think back to times in our history when very unpopular speech was allowed, even though popular sentiment would have stopped it, you can see the reasoning here. Think back to the Civil Rights era. If we had said only non-offensive speech is protected, the Civil Rights era may never have taken off. It was not popular speech back when it first started. So we have to be very careful with what we call that slippery slope. And in fact, there is legitimate reason to believe that it's offensive speech that needs the protection more than anything. That warm, fuzzy speech, nobody's going to object to. So, unfortunately, as much as we would like to stop the Westboro people, the Supreme Court said that their message could go on. It is, however, in terms of karma, coming back to them because at last report, their church was starting to flounder. So I guess that is just, called just desserts. But in any event, go ahead now with the PowerPoint on the Second Amendment case, the right to bear arms, and at some point take a look at the discussion on funeral protests.